The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside County Courthouse as people filed in for another day of legal proceedings. Among them was David Johnson, a 42-year-old software engineer who had taken the morning off work to handle what he thought would be a simple traffic ticket. He wore his best Navy suit and carried a folder with all his documents neatly organized, hoping to resolve the matter quickly and professionally. David had received the speeding ticket 3 weeks earlier while rushing to his daughter's school play. The officer had clocked him going 38 in a 25 zone near the elementary school. It was a fair cop, and David had no intention of fighting it. He just wanted to pay the fine and move on with his life. What he didn't expect was what would happen when he walked into Judge Patricia Blackwood's courtroom. Judge Blackwood had been on the bench for 12 years, and her reputation preceded her. She was known for being tough, but lately, court staff had begun to notice disturbing patterns in her behavior. Today, she sat behind her imposing wooden bench like a queen on her throne, her gray hair pulled back severely, and her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. The American flag hung limply beside her chair, and the scales of justice seemed to mock the proceedings that were about to unfold. When David's name was called, he approached the bench with quiet confidence. He had appeared in court before for work-related matters and knew the proper etiquette. Standing straight with his hands clasped behind his back, he waited respectfully for the judge to acknowledge him. "State your name for the record," Judge Blackwood said without looking up from her papers, her voice carrying an edge that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. "David Johnson, Your Honor," he replied clearly. The judge finally looked up, and something immediately changed in her demeanor. Her eyes narrowed as she took in David's appearance, her gaze lingering longer than necessary. The courtroom fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. "So, Mr. Johnson," she began, emphasizing his name with barely concealed disdain, "you were caught speeding in a school zone, 38 in a 25. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "Yes, Your Honor, I absolutely do. I have a daughter myself, and I take school zone safety very seriously. I was running late to her school play and made a poor judgment call. I take full responsibility." Judge Blackwood leaned back in her chair, a cold smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, you take responsibility now. How convenient. I suppose you think showing up here in your fancy suit is going to impress me?" David blinked, confused by the hostile tone. "No, Your Honor. I dressed appropriately for court out of respect." "Respect," she repeated mockingly. "That's rich. You know what would show real respect? Following the speed limit in the first place. But I suppose that's too much to ask from someone like you." The phrase hung in the air like poison. Several members of the court staff exchanged glances, and the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her machine. David felt his chest tighten, but he maintained his composure. "Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of my violation, and I'm prepared to pay the fine." Judge Blackwood shuffled through the papers on her desk with deliberate slowness, making David wait. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, she looked up again. "Let me guess. You probably have some sob story about how you're the breadwinner of your family, how you can't afford to pay a big fine, how this ticket is going to ruin your life. I've heard it all before from people in your situation." David's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "No, Your Honor, I'm simply here to resolve this matter appropriately. I have no excuses for my driving that day." "No excuses," she mused. "How refreshing. Though I find that hard to believe. Your type always has excuses. Always blaming someone else, always playing the victim." The courtroom was now completely silent except for the sound of uncomfortable shifting in the wooden benches behind David. A young law student in the gallery pulled out her phone to record, but quickly put it away when the bailiff shook his head. Judge Blackwood pulled up David's driving record on her computer, her fingers clicking aggressively on the keys. "I see you've had a clean record for the past 8 years. No tickets, no violations. Very impressive. Almost too good to be true, if you ask me." "I try to be a careful driver, Your Honor." "Try," she repeated with a snort. "Well, your trying didn't work out so well 3 weeks ago, did it? Speeding past a school where children were present. Do you even care about the safety of those kids, or Were you too busy with whatever important business people like you think you have? David took a deep breath, his hands still clasped behind his back. Your Honor, I care deeply about child safety. As I mentioned, I have a daughter of my own. My mistake that day was inexcusable, and I'm here to accept the consequences. Your daughter, Judge Blackwood said, leaning forward. I'm sure she's very proud to have a father who speeds through school zones. What kind of example are you setting? For her? What kind of values are you teaching her at home? The questions felt like slaps across the face. David could feel his pulse quickening, but years of professional training had taught him how to remain calm under pressure. He couldn't have known that this very training would serve him well in ways he never could have imagined. I try to teach my daughter to take responsibility for her actions and to treat all people with respect, Your Honor. Judge Blackwood's eyes flashed with anger at what she perceived as a subtle criticism. Don't you dare lecture me about respect, young man. You want to talk about respect? Respect is following the law. Respect is not endangering children. Respect is not wasting the court's time with your presence. She turned to her computer again, typing furiously. The standard fine for David's violation was $150, but Judge Blackwood had other plans. Given the serious nature of your offense, your cavalier attitude, and the need to send a strong message to others who might think they can just speed through our community with impunity, I'm fining you $500. Gasps could be heard from the gallery. The fine was more than 3 times the usual amount for such a violation. David's lawyer friend, who had advised him over coffee the previous week, had told him to expect no more than $200 at most. Additionally, Judge Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying the power she wielded, I'm ordering you to complete 40 hours of community service. Maybe spending some time cleaning up after others will teach you something about being a productive member of society. The punishment was excessive, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. For a first-time speeding violation with no aggravating circumstances, it was completely disproportionate. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. And let me make something very clear, Mr. Johnson. If I ever see you in my courtroom again, if you so much as jaywalked across the street, I'll throw the book at you. People like you need to learn that actions have consequences. Real consequences. David stood silently for a moment, processing what had just happened. The injustice was obvious, the discrimination barely concealed, but he knew that arguing would only make things worse. Instead, he nodded slowly. I understand, Your Honor. Will that be all? Judge Blackwood waved her hand dismissively. Yes, get out of my courtroom. Next case. As David turned to leave, he walked with the same quiet dignity he had entered with. But something had changed in those few minutes. The respectful citizen who had come to pay a simple fine had witnessed something that shook him to his core. He had seen justice perverted, watched as bias and prejudice wore the robes of authority. What Judge Blackwood didn't know was that David Johnson was much more than a software engineer, and in exactly 7 minutes, her world would come crashing down around her. David walked out of Judge Blackwood's courtroom with measured steps, his face showing no emotion despite the storm brewing inside him. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a soft thud, and he found himself in the marble-floored hallway of the courthouse. Other people waiting for their cases looked at him with sympathy, having witnessed the unfair treatment he had just endured. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached him. I'm so sorry about what happened in there, she whispered. That was completely wrong. Everyone could see it. David nodded politely but didn't respond. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was silence. As he walked down the hallway, he could hear people behind him talking in hushed tones about what they had just witnessed. Words like unfair, biased, and disgusting floated through the air. But instead of heading toward the exit like everyone expected, David made a left turn toward the administrative wing of the courthouse. His footsteps echoed in the quieter hallway as he passed offices filled with clerks, paralegals, and court administrators going about their daily work. Meanwhile, back in her courtroom, Judge Blackwood was already calling the next case. She seemed pleased with herself, adjusting her robes with satisfaction as if she had just delivered some great service to justice. The court reporter continued typing, though her fingers moved more slowly than usual. She had been working in this courthouse for 15 years and had never seen anything quite like what had just happened. Next case, Peterson versus the state, Judge Blackwood announced, her voice carrying the same authority it always had. But something felt different in the courtroom now. The air seemed heavier, and people in the gallery kept glancing toward the door David had walked through just minutes earlier. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, had been working courthouse security for 8 years. He had seen his share of difficult cases and heated exchanges, but what he had just witnessed bothered him deeply. He kept thinking about the respectful way David had handled himself, never raising his voice or showing disrespect, even when faced with such obvious bias. As Judge Blackwood proceeded with the next case, she had no idea that her entire world was about to change. She was so focused on maintaining her image of authority that she failed to notice the subtle shifts happening around her. The court clerk was typing more quietly than usual. The prosecutor kept glancing at his phone. Even the defense attorney seemed distracted. Down the hall, David had reached his destination. He approached a door marked Internal Security Division and knocked twice before entering. The receptionist, Mrs. Chen, looked up from her computer with a welcoming smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. When he opened it, a gold badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Next to it was an identification card that read, "Detective David Johnson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Affairs Division." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened slightly as she read the credentials. "Detective Johnson, we've been expecting you. Please, go right in. Agent Thompson is waiting." David walked through the inner door into a small office where a woman in her 50s sat behind a desk covered with files and recording equipment. Agent Lisa Thompson had been with the FBI for 22 years, specializing in corruption cases within the judicial system. She looked up as David entered, her expression serious but welcoming. "How did it go?" she asked, gesturing for him to take a seat. David sat down and let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Even worse than we expected." She took the bait completely. The traffic ticket scenario worked perfectly. Agent Thompson nodded grimly. "I was listening to the audio feed from the wire you were wearing. She said things that even shocked me, and I've heard it all in this job." For the past 6 months, the FBI had been investigating reports of judicial bias and corruption in the local court system. Multiple complaints had been filed against Judge Blackwood, but complaints alone weren't enough to build a federal case. They needed evidence, real proof of discriminatory behavior that violated citizens' civil rights. That's where David came in. As a federal detective specializing in undercover operations, he had volunteered to pose as an ordinary citizen to test the allegations against Judge Blackwood. The traffic ticket had been carefully orchestrated. David had actually been pulled over 3 weeks earlier, but by an officer who was part of the investigation. The whole thing had been planned to create a realistic scenario. The recording equipment picked up everything clearly. Agent Thompson continued, adjusting her headphones. Her comments about people like him and his type were particularly damning. Combined with the excessive fine and community service hours, we have clear evidence of discriminatory sentencing. David loosened his tie and sat back in his chair. She didn't hold back at all. It was like she wanted to make sure everyone in that courtroom knew exactly how she felt. "That's actually good for our case," Agent Thompson said, though her tone suggested she took no pleasure in the situation. "The more obvious her bias, the stronger our evidence becomes." She turned to her computer and pulled up a file filled with similar complaints. "We've had 17 formal complaints against Judge Blackwood in the past 2 years. All from defendants who claimed they were treated unfairly based on their race. But until now, we only had their word against hers." David looked at the screen, scrolling through case after case of similar stories. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on our investigation, probably for years. But she's been smart about it, usually keeping her comments just subtle enough to avoid clear evidence. What happened today was different. She got comfortable, maybe even arrogant. She thought she was just dealing with another ordinary citizen who had no power to fight back." Agent Thompson stood up and walked to a window overlooking the courthouse parking lot. You know what the worst part is? She probably goes home every night thinking she's serving justice. In her mind, she's protecting society by being tough on people she sees as troublemakers. The scary part is how natural it seemed to her, David said. Like she's done this so many times that it's become automatic. That's exactly why we need to stop her, Agent Thompson replied. Every person who has stood before her bench deserved fair treatment under the law. Instead, they got her personal prejudices dressed up as legal authority. She returned to her desk and picked up a thick folder. We've been building this case for months, David. Your testimony today, combined with the audio recording and the pattern of complaints we've documented, gives us everything we need to move forward. David stood up and walked to the window himself, looking down at the courthouse steps where people came every day seeking justice. What happens now? Agent Thompson checked her watch. Now we execute the arrest warrant. Federal marshals are already in position throughout the building. We've been waiting for this moment for a long time. How long do I have before we move? Judge Blackwood typically takes a 10-minute recess between cases. Based on the court schedule, that should be in about 4 minutes. That's when we'll approach her. David felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice would finally be served, but sadness that it had taken so long and that so many people had been hurt along the way. You did good work today, Detective, Agent Thompson said. I know it wasn't easy to stand there and take that kind of treatment, even knowing it was for a larger purpose. David nodded. It's part of the job, but I kept thinking about all the people who had to endure that same treatment without knowing that someone was watching, someone who cared about making it right. As they prepared to leave the office, Agent Thompson handed David an earpiece. Stay connected to our communication channel. When we make the arrest, I want you to be the one to approach her first. She needs to see that the man she just humiliated is the same man who brought her down. David put the earpiece in and straightened his tie. In just a few minutes, Judge Patricia Blackwood would learn that her victim was actually her judge. And, unlike her courtroom, this judgment would be fair, legal, and long overdue. Judge Blackwood banged her gavel and announced a 10-minute recess, just as Agent Thompson had predicted. She gathered her papers with the same smug satisfaction she had shown throughout the morning, completely unaware that her career was about to come to a crashing end. The courtroom began to empty as people filed out to stretch their legs or grab coffee from the vending machines down the hall. Court will resume in 10 minutes, she announced to the nearly empty room before standing up from her imposing chair behind the bench. Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff, watched her carefully as she prepared to leave for her chambers. He had been secretly communicating with the FBI team through a small earpiece, providing updates on the judge's movements throughout the morning. His job was to make sure she didn't leave the building or go anywhere that might complicate the arrest. Judge Blackwood walked toward her private chambers, her black robes flowing behind her like a dark cloud. She felt particularly pleased with how she had handled the Johnson case. In her twisted mind, she believed she had sent a strong message to anyone who thought they could disrespect her courtroom. She had no idea that in less than 7 minutes, she would be the one facing judgment. As she reached for the door handle to her chambers, she heard footsteps behind her in the hallway. She turned around, expecting to see a clerk or perhaps a lawyer seeking a private word. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with David Johnson, the same man she had just humiliated and overcharged in her courtroom. "What are you doing back here?" she snapped, her voice immediately taking on the same hostile tone she had used earlier. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only. You need to leave immediately." David stood calmly in front of her, his hands at his sides, no longer clasped behind his back in the submissive posture he had maintained in her courtroom. Something about his entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the respectful citizen seeking to resolve a simple traffic ticket. In his place stood a man with quiet confidence and unmistakable authority. "Judge Blackwood," David said in a steady voice that carried no trace of the deference he had shown earlier. "My name is Detective David Johnson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his leather wallet. opening it to reveal the gold badge and federal identification that had been hidden throughout their earlier encounter. The fluorescent lights in the hallway caught the badge, making it gleam like a beacon of justice. Judge Blackwood's face went through a series of rapid changes. First confusion, as her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. Then disbelief, as she tried to convince herself this was some kind of mistake or joke. Finally, horror, as the full implications of the situation began to dawn on her. That's impossible, she stammered, taking a step backward until her back hit the door to her chambers. You're just some traffic violator. You were speeding through a school zone. Actually, I wasn't, David replied calmly. The traffic stop 3 weeks ago was part of a federal investigation into judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. Everything that happened in your courtroom today was recorded and witnessed by federal agents. As if summoned by his words, Agent Thompson appeared at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 federal marshals in dark suits. Their footsteps echoed ominously in the quiet corridor as they approached. Judge Blackwood's eyes darted between David and the approaching agents, her face now pale with realization. This is some kind of setup, she said, her voice rising with panic. This is entrapment. You can't do this to me. I'm a sitting judge. I have immunity. David shook his head slowly. Judicial immunity doesn't protect you from federal civil rights violations, Judge Blackwood. When you denied me equal treatment under the law based on your racial bias, you committed a federal crime. Agent Thompson reached them and stood beside David, her expression professional but firm. Judge Patricia Blackwood, you are under arrest for violation of civil rights under color of law, judicial misconduct, and conspiracy to deny constitutional rights. The words hit Judge Blackwood like physical blows. She looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route or someone who might help her. But the hallway that had always been her domain, where she had walked with unchallenged authority for 12 years, now felt like a trap closing around her. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Thompson continued, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Wait, Judge Blackwood interrupted, her voice cracking with desperation. There's been a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. I was being tough on crime. That's what judges are supposed to do. David stepped closer, his voice remaining calm but carrying the weight of authority. Being tough on crime doesn't include making racist comments about defendants. It doesn't include imposing excessive fines based on someone's race. And it certainly doesn't include asking invasive personal questions designed to humiliate people. Judge, Blackwood's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she leaned more heavily against her chamber door. I never said anything racist. I treat everyone the same way. We have audio recordings of everything you said in that courtroom today, Agent Thompson said. Your comments about people like him and his type were clearly discriminatory, combined. With the excessive fine and community service hours you imposed, it constitutes a clear pattern of bias. The second federal marshal stepped forward with additional paperwork. We also have a warrant to search your chambers and computer records. Our investigation has revealed a pattern of discriminatory sentencing that goes back several years. Judge, Blackwood's eyes widened further. My computer, my chambers, you can't do that. There are confidential case files in there. The warrant is comprehensive, Agent Thompson replied. We're particularly interested in sentencing disparities between defendants of different races for similar crimes. As the reality of her situation began to sink in, Judge Blackwood's arrogance finally cracked completely. Tears began to form in her eyes and her voice became pleading. Please, you don't understand. I have a reputation to maintain. I have a family. This will destroy everything I've worked for. David felt no satisfaction in seeing her break down, only a sense that justice was finally being served. You should have thought about that before you decided to use your position to discriminate against people who came to your court seeking fair treatment. I can change, she said desperately. I can take sensitivity training. I can do community service myself. Just don't arrest me, please. Agent Thompson shook her head. It's too late for that, Judge Blackwood. The damage you've done to the justice system and to individual lives cannot be undone with a training course. By now, word of what was happening had spread throughout the courthouse. Court clerks, lawyers, and other staff members were gathering, at a respectful distance, watching in stunned silence as one of their most powerful figures was brought down. Some looked shocked, others relieved, as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. Officer Rodriguez appeared at the other end of the hallway, ensuring that no one interfered with the arrest. He had worked under Judge Blackwood's authority for years, watching her treat people unfairly but feeling powerless to stop it. Now, finally, someone with the power to act had stepped in. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Agent Thompson instructed. Judge Blackwood looked at David one more time, as if hoping he might show mercy or reveal that this was all some terrible mistake. But David's expression remained professional and resolute. The man she had thought she could humiliate with impunity was now the instrument of her downfall. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Judge Blackwood's 12-year reign of biased justice officially came to an end. The woman who had perverted the very concept of equal treatment under the law was now experiencing the justice system from the other side, where everyone truly was supposed to be treated equally regardless of their position or power. As Judge Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, the courthouse buzzed with activity like a disturbed beehive. Federal agents moved through the building with purpose, armed with search warrants and evidence collection equipment. What had started as a routine, morning in the judicial system had transformed into one of the most significant corruption investigations the county had ever seen. Agent Thompson led a team of forensic specialists into Judge Blackwood's chambers, while David coordinated with the marshals to secure all potential evidence. The office that had once been a symbol of judicial authority now looked more like a crime scene, with investigators photographing everything and carefully cataloging items for examination. "Look at this," called out Agent Wilson, a computer forensics expert who was examining Judge Blackwood's desktop computer. "She's got a folder labeled Problem Cases that goes back 3 years. Most of the files in here are cases involving minority defendants." David walked over to examine the screen. What he saw made his stomach turn. Judge Blackwood had been keeping detailed notes about cases, but not the kind of professional records a judge should maintain. Instead, her notes were filled with personal opinions and biased observations about defendants based on their appearance, race, and perceived social status. She wrote things like typical troublemaker and probably lying next to defendants' names, Agent Wilson continued, scrolling through the files. "But look at this. For cases involving white defendants with similar charges, her notes are completely different. She wrote things like seems genuine and deserves second chance." Agent Thompson joined them at the computer, shaking her head in disgust. "This is exactly what we suspected, but seeing it documented in her own words makes it even worse. She wasn't just being biased in the moment. She was systematically targeting certain groups of people. The investigation team had been preparing for this moment for months. They had received their first formal complaint about Judge Blackwood 2 years earlier from a defense attorney named James Crawford, who had noticed unusual patterns in her sentencing. He had represented clients from various backgrounds and noticed that his minority clients consistently received harsher penalties than white clients for identical crimes. "We need to pull up the sentencing database," David said. "Let's see if the patterns are as clear as we think they are." Agent Martinez, a statistical analyst with the FBI, had already begun running comparisons. She pulled up a large monitor and began displaying charts and graphs that told a shocking story. For first-time drug possession charges over the past 3 years, Judge Blackwood sentenced white defendants to an average of 6 months probation. For the same exact charges, minority defendants received an average of 18 months probation, plus community service and higher fines. The numbers were damning, but they got worse as the team dug deeper. Traffic violations, petty theft, disorderly conduct. In every category of crime, there was a clear and consistent pattern of discriminatory sentencing. Judge Blackwood had been using her position to systematically deny equal justice under the law. "Here's something interesting," Agent Wilson said from the computer. "She's been in email communication with a group called Concerned Citizens for Law and Order. The messages in here are filled with racist language and discussions about keeping certain elements in line." David read over his shoulder, feeling sick as he saw the ugly truth behind Judge Blackwood's behavior. She hadn't been acting alone or making split-second decisions based on unconscious bias. She had been part of a deliberate effort to use the justice system as a weapon against minority communities. Agent Thompson's phone rang and she answered it immediately. "Thompson here. Yes, we found it. How many cases?" "Jesus Christ. Okay, start preparing the paperwork immediately." She hung up and turned to the team with a grave expression. That was the U.S. Attorney's Office. They've been reviewing cases that will need to be reopened based on our findings. We're looking at potentially hundreds of cases where Judge Blackwood's bias may have affected the outcome. The implications were staggering. Hundreds of people who had stood before Judge Blackwood's bench over the years had been denied fair treatment. Some had been sent to jail when they should have received probation. Others had been hit with excessive fines that created financial hardship for their families. The ripple effects of her discrimination had touched countless lives. "What about appeals?" David asked. "How many people tried to challenge her decisions?" Agent Martinez pulled up another database. "That's the most heartbreaking part. Very few people appealed her decisions because most couldn't afford attorneys. They just accepted the harsh sentences and tried to move on with their lives. They had no idea that what happened to them was illegal." The team continued working through the afternoon, uncovering layer after layer of corruption and bias. They found that Judge Blackwood had been particularly harsh during certain times of the year, often coinciding with local elections when she wanted to appear tough on crime to voters. She had used real people's lives as political props to advance her own career. "Look at this pattern," Agent Wilson said, pointing to the screen. "Right before every election cycle, her sentencing gets significantly harsher across the board, but especially for minority defendants. She was literally using discrimination as a campaign strategy." David felt a mix of anger and sadness as he thought about all the families that had been torn apart by Judge Blackwood's actions. Children who had grown up without fathers because of excessive jail sentences. Families pushed into poverty by unreasonable fines. Dreams destroyed by a criminal justice system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. Agent Thompson received another phone call, this time from the FBI director's office in Washington. The case had attracted attention at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. "Yes, sir, we have extensive documentation, video and audio recordings, computer files. Yes, we expect this to be a landmark case." "Understood, sir." After hanging up, she addressed the team. "Washington wants a full briefing by tomorrow morning. This case is going to send shockwaves through the entire judicial system. Other districts are going to start looking at their own judges more carefully." As the day wore on, more evidence emerged. They found records showing that Judge Blackwood had been receiving kickbacks from a private probation company that made money from the community service programs she frequently assigned. The corruption went even deeper than simple racial bias. She had been profiting financially from her discriminatory practices. This explains the excessive community service hours she was assigning, David realized. She was getting paid for every hour of community service she ordered. The more people she sent to these programs, the more money she made. The private probation company had been charging defendants fees for supervision, drug testing, and administrative costs. Judge Blackwood had been receiving quarterly payments disguised as consulting fees for steering business their way. She had turned the justice system into a personal profit center. Agent Thompson stood in the middle of the chambers, looking at the evidence scattered across every surface. "You know what strikes me most about all this? She kept such detailed records. It's like she was proud of what she was doing. She never thought she'd be caught." "That's the thing about people in power," David replied. "Sometimes they get so comfortable that they forget they're not above the law themselves." As evening approached, the evidence collection was nearly complete. The team had gathered thousands of documents, dozens of computer files, and testimony from court staff who had witnessed Judge Blackwood's behavior over the years. The case against her was overwhelming and undeniable, but perhaps the most powerful evidence was the recording of what had happened that morning in her courtroom. A device, hidden wire, had captured every word, every inflection, every moment of bias and discrimination. When played for a jury, it would tell the story more clearly than any statistic or database could. The investigation had revealed not just one corrupt judge, but an entire system that had failed to protect citizens from abuse of power. Tomorrow would bring even more revelations as the case made national headlines and sparked conversations about justice, equality, and accountability in courtrooms across America. The next morning, news vans lined the street outside the federal courthouse as reporters from across the country gathered to cover what had already become the biggest judicial corruption story of the year. The headline, "Federal Judge Arrested by Man She Racially Profiled," had spread like wildfire across social media, sparking national conversations about bias in the justice system. David stood at the podium outside the courthouse, squinting slightly in the bright camera lights as dozens of microphones were thrust toward him. Behind him, Agent Thompson and other members of the FBI team waited to answer questions about the investigation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Less than 24 hours ago, David had been the victim of judicial abuse, and now he was the face of justice being served. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice steady and professional. "Yesterday morning I entered Judge Patricia Blackwood's courtroom as part of a federal investigation into reports of judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. What happened in that courtroom exceeded even our worst expectations." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. For too long, Judge Blackwood used her position of authority to deny citizens their constitutional right to equal treatment under the law. Yesterday, that came to an end. A reporter from Channel 7 News raised her hand. "Detective Johnson, can you tell us how long this investigation has been going on?" "The FBI has been investigating complaints against Judge Blackwood for over 6 months, David replied. "We received multiple reports from defendants, attorneys, and even courthouse staff about discriminatory practices. However, complaints alone weren't enough. We needed concrete evidence, which is why yesterday's undercover operation was necessary." The questions came rapidly. "How many cases are being reviewed? Will there be more arrests? What happens to people who were sentenced unfairly?" Agent Thompson stepped forward to field the more technical questions. "We're currently reviewing approximately 400 cases that were handled by Judge Blackwood over the past 3 years. Our preliminary analysis suggests that dozens of these cases involved discriminatory sentencing that violated federal civil rights laws." Inside the courthouse, the wheels of justice were already turning. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had assembled a team of prosecutors to handle not only Judge Blackwood's case, but also the massive undertaking of reviewing and potentially overturning wrongful convictions. The federal government was taking this case seriously at the highest levels. Judge Blackwood sat in a holding cell just a few floors above the press conference, a far cry from the mahogany-paneled chambers where she had wielded unchecked power for so many years. She had been denied bail due to the seriousness of the charges and the potential for her to interfere with the ongoing investigation. Her attorney, a high-priced criminal defense lawyer from the state capitol, was already talking about plea negotiations. The story was having ripple effects far beyond just one courthouse. Judicial oversight committees in neighboring districts were launching their own reviews. Law schools were organizing seminars on judicial ethics. Civil rights organizations were setting up hotlines for people to report similar experiences with biased judges. Dr. Patricia Williams, a law professor at the state university, had been following the case closely. She appeared on the morning news shows to provide context about the broader implications. "What we're seeing here isn't just about one bad judge," she explained to viewers. "This case highlights systemic problems in how we monitor and hold accountable the people we entrust with enormous power over citizens' lives." Back at the FBI field office, Agent Thompson was coordinating with victim services coordinators to reach out to people who had been harmed by Judge Blackwood's actions. This was perhaps the most challenging part of the entire investigation, identifying and contacting hundreds of people whose lives had been negatively impacted by biased sentencing. "We've set up a special hotline," Agent Thompson explained to David as they reviewed case files. "We're encouraging anyone who appeared before Judge Blackwood and felt they were treated unfairly to call us. We want to make sure every victim has a chance to have their case reviewed." The response was overwhelming. Within hours of the hotline being announced, hundreds of calls flooded in. People shared stories of excessive fines that had created financial hardship, jail sentences that seemed disproportionate to their crimes, and community service assignments that had disrupted their work and family life. One of the first callers was Robert Chen, a college student who had appeared before Judge Blackwood 6 months earlier for a minor drug possession charge. He had received 18 months of probation and 200 hours of community service, while his white roommate, arrested for the same offense just a week later, had received only 6 months probation from a different judge. "I thought that was just how the system worked," Robert told the FBI investigators. "I didn't know I could challenge it. I just did my community service and tried to move on with my life." Another caller was Maria Rodriguez, a single mother who had been fined $800 for a traffic violation that normally carried a $200 penalty. The excessive fine had forced her to choose between paying rent and paying the court, ultimately leading to her eviction when she prioritized the legal obligation. "I lost my apartment because of that fine," Maria said through tears during her call. "My kids and I had to move in with my mother. I worked 2 jobs just to get back on my feet. I never understood why my fine was so much higher than what my neighbor paid for the same thing." These stories were heartbreaking, but they were also crucial evidence in building the federal case against Judge Blackwood. Each victim's experience added another layer to the pattern of discrimination that prosecutors would present to a jury. The private probation company that had been paying kickbacks to Judge Blackwood was also under investigation. Federal agents had raided their offices and discovered that the corruption extended to other judges in different districts. What had started as an investigation into one biased judge was uncovering a network of corruption that spanned multiple jurisdictions. 3 weeks after her arrest, Judge Blackwood appeared in federal court for her arraignment. The same courthouse where she had once held absolute power now hosted her humiliation as she stood before a different judge, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of black robes. The charges against her were serious: violating civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to deny constitutional rights, accepting bribes, and mail fraud related to the kickback scheme. If convicted on all counts, she faced up to 20 years in federal prison. David watched the proceeding from the gallery, surrounded by some of the victims whose cases were being reviewed. The transformation was complete. The woman who had abused her power to humiliate and discriminate was now experiencing the justice system as a defendant, subject to the same laws she had sworn to uphold. Judge Blackwood's defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty, but everyone in the courtroom knew the evidence against her was overwhelming. The audio recording of her discriminatory treatment of David alone would be devastating to her defense, and that was just the beginning of the prosecution's case. The presiding judge, the Honorable Michael Thompson, set a trial date for 6 months in the future. "The defendant will remain in custody pending trial," he announced. Given the nature of these charges and the defendant's former position of authority, the court finds that she poses a significant risk to the integrity of the judicial system if released. As Judge Blackwood was led away, several victims in the gallery felt a sense of closure they had never expected. For years, they had carried the burden of what they believed was their own failure to navigate the legal system properly. Now they understood that they had been victims of deliberate discrimination, and that their government was taking action to make things right. The case became a landmark moment in American jurisprudence, demonstrating that no one, regardless of their position or power, is above the law. It sparked reforms in judicial oversight and inspired other investigations into potential bias in court systems across the country. For David, the case represented the best of what law enforcement could accomplish when it worked properly. Justice had been served not through revenge or retribution, but through careful investigation, proper procedures, and accountability. The man who had been humiliated in a courtroom had become the instrument through which true justice was finally delivered.